Now let's learn how to go edit a single record. First thing we're going to want to do is come into our student controller, and we're going to need to write an action method for editing. So in that action method, it's going to be called edit. It's going to receive one parameter called ID, which is nullable. And then one thing that's very important is that in our action methods, we can have more than one action method with the same name. And we can do that not only because of signatures, but one action method might be what they call an HTTP GET, and the other could be an HTTP POST. That means that when you go and try to get data and send it to a view, the system is smart enough to go and look for the HTTP GET action method. And you can specify that simply by putting attributes on that action method. Square bracket, HTTP GET, and edit. So let's understand what this edit action method does for the HTTP GET. It says whenever we go and try to retrieve data from the model to send it to the view, the system will look for an action method of that same name as the view and vice versa, and then try to see if there's one identified as an HTTP GET. Then it says, is there a parameter that was received? Yes, there was. So create a variable for student majors and make it an IEnumerable, and then use the database context object .database.sql query. Go select that record, or more than one record, but it will be one record. Return it back to that variable as an IEnumerable, and then let's go and return to the view that new variable we just loaded up with data, and we're going to tell it just return the first record. So it sends one record back to the edit view. Now we need to create that view. So let's go ahead and right mouse click on that view line and choose add view. We're going to do edit, and we're going to say that it's an edit, and we're going to choose our model, which will be student majors. We'll click add, and it's now going to use scaffolding and go and create our model. And notice, just like with that details, instead of receiving an IEnumerable for the model using Razor, it's simply a single record. Then we do what we call using HTML begin form. That's an HTML action method. Its whole job is to build an HTML form and build all the tags necessary to work with that. We then call something called anti-forgery token. We really like using this HTML helper because when you're getting data in a form and then you're trying to send it back to save, hackers could actually use something called cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting. The abbreviation or acronym is XSS. The cross-site scripting, or XSS, enables attackers to go and inject client-side scripts into your web pages. So this is something that we're really happy that MVC incorporates in our website. Then we just start creating our form. There's our form right there, and we do something called validation summary. What the validation summary will do is it will go out and check the model and make sure that everything works on that model for anything that might be required. We'll see that a little bit later on in another video. Then we actually use our HTML helper for hidden for. The HTML helper hidden for creates a hidden input on our form for a field on our model. And we can actually tell it which field we want to hold that value. And that hidden for method does what we call binding for a specific model object, in our case the student ID, to the input type hidden HTML. So what happens is it automatically sets up a value for that model property to that hidden field so that you can use that later on when moving back and forth between the view. In other words, we need that student ID value in order for us to work with that record in the entity framework, because that's our primary key. At the same time, we don't want the end user to see it or mess with it because it is that primary key and it's the identity key. So we include it in our form, but we just say it's a hidden field in the form. That way it's still there and still present, but the end user can't change it. Then we have a HTML helper label for, and that will actually go and create an input label. And then we have an editor for, which will create an input box. And then we have a validation message for that first name in case we want to go ahead and modify that. And this would actually link any error message requirements that we have in our model with this view. So let's say this field was required and we specified that in our model, and we tried to save the record without entering in the first name. Then this HTML helper would go out and grab that required message out of the model and display it if this field was left empty. The rest of these fields are set up with the editor for, and then at the very bottom we say we have our form group and we have an input type submit. This just means we have a button with the text value of save, so you'll see the word save on the default button, and when you click on it, we're telling HTML or the server that we are doing a submit for that record. So let's see what we need to do next. There's our view back in our controller. There's our get, which serves the data up. So if I save that and I ran it right now, going back to my index, and I'll run that website, and on the landing page I'll click on View Students. And then it will display the list of students. And I'll click on Edit Billy Bob. And there's Billy Ray Bob. And notice that here's the labels, which I could have written my own labels rather than pulling the database column labels out. And here's the data. That's my editor, and it's inside of a box. That's my editor for. I could come in here and change that. And then when I try to click Save, it's going to say it's trying to do a submit, meaning it will try to find the HTTP post for the edit. And this says student edit receiving a parameter does not exist. So we need to now go and write that action method. So let's go back to our student controller. We have our HTTP get. So now let's write the in that HTTP post. First thing, I specify the attribute for the action method edit. Then we have the validate anti-forgery token attribute. And what this does is it writes a unique value to an HTTP only cookie, and then that same value is written to the form. And when you go to submit the page, an error is raised if the cookie value doesn't match the form value on the server side. And so what this does is it prevents cross-site request forgeries. And that means if a form from another site tries to post to your site trying to use authenticated credentials, then the system will say, no, that doesn't match. Your cookie doesn't match the form, and so we know that something weird is going on. And what that does is that means an attacker is trying to trick the logged in user into submitting a form. And the validate anti-forgery token will stop that. Then we have our actual edit method, and then we say the word bind. In this case, we said we want to bind, and the bind attribute lets us fine-tune our model binding process. It tells the model binder to only populate properties with the name specified. Student ID, first name, last name, enrollment date, major ID. In other words, we don't have to do all the fields on that form. We can tell it which ones we want to work with. The other thing we've done is instead of using the student majors model, we said we're now using the student model, and we're calling it students. And why did we do that? Because we left off that major description. And earlier, we said that the student model was actually bound to a table. There's the student model, and it's bound to the student table. And since we have the student table, we've also have different required messages set up. So let's see what happens if we try to add something without putting that data in. So once again, what's happening on our edit? It's going to be a post. We do this to protect ourselves from people that want to mess up our data. We have our edit action method. We say bind and include only these fields from the form. We leave off major description. We say we're using this model. And then we said if the model is valid, then go to the database, which is our Hard Knocks database, .entry, working with the student's model, all the data received, check its state, and then we're saying, has it been modified? Now, this is redlined, so you need to right mouse click on it, resolve. So it now says, hey, has this record been modified? And then we say, go ahead and save the changes to that database. When we execute this line, what's happening is that we're attaching the entity to our DB context, and we're marking it what we call dirty. This means that when you do a save change, the entity framework is going to go ahead and generate a SQL Server update. So it's almost like it's saying update, I'll do it in comments so it doesn't try to correct it, update student set, and then it lists all the fields for the sets, and then it has a where clause, the student ID equals to some value. So that's what this statement is generating for us, so that when we do the save changes, that update statement actually gets created and it updates the data. And then when we're done, we just redirect back to the index method. So let's go see how that works. Let's go ahead and run the application. We'll run that and it's going to display our landing page. And then we'll click on our view students. We'll see all the data show up. I'll click on Billy Ray Bob. And let's wipe out Billy Ray Bob's name and try to do a save. Remember, when I click on the save in the view, that's actually a submit button for the HTML form, which then tries to call the HTTP post for the edit method. And it says, you didn't have a last name. Now, where did you get that from? Because we said, let's bind the HTTP post to the student model. And the student model has required validations for each of the fields. So I could type in Billy Ray Bobby and click save, and it works just fine. And notice it changed it over here. Let's try one more thing. Click on edit again, and we're going to put Billy Ray Bobby did a good job. I'll change it back to Bob. I'm going to click save. Notice I put 4.0 in GPA. It did not show it. Now, why didn't it show it? Let's close that, come back over to here and stop it from running. And that's because, look at the model. We said, let's bind and include those fields. Well, what field do you notice has been left out? The GPA. So we need to say student underscore GPA, comma, and you can see that's the whole statement there. So we included the student GPA now. Let's save that one more time and go back to the index, run it again. And now let's see if the entity framework is smart enough to actually bind the GPA to that field when we try to do the update, and see if it updates our student model. Click on View Students, go back to Billy Ray, 4.0, save, and now it saves. And that's how we edit records. So once again, just to make sure you understand how those required messages are working, first of all, we said we have a validation summary, and then we have the validation message for, and then within the model itself, we have required messages set up. That's all you have to do, and now you can now make fields required in edit forms.